Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's Leading Edge Membership webinar, Succession Planning is Outdated, a New Approach to Managing Leadership Transition. Welcome Maisha Forbes, who will introduce and get to talk to you for this hour in just a moment. My name is Jean Bell. I direct the Advancing Practice program here at Nonprofit Quarterly, and this is part of our program for advancing management and leadership practice. And I can't think of a more timely conversation with respect to leadership and governance than succession planning. Even with COVID-19 and with the surge in social unrest and activism, we're still seeing lots of boards and executives grappling with filling senior positions and executive positions. So I'm so glad to have Maisha here today. Let me go over a few session logistics before we dive in. As always, we're recording this session. Our team will get this back out to you with the slides and the recording within a couple of days. We have a hashtag to use on Twitter, NPQ Pathways, and it's called that because Maisha is going to talk about pathway planning as an alternative approach or an updated approach to succession planning. We've disabled the chat function, and we're just using the Q&A box for you to enter your comments or questions, and I'll be moderating that throughout the session. And as always, there'll also be an evaluation that pops up immediately as the webinar ends, and it's just got 4 or 5 questions on it. And we use that to set the content for future sessions and continue to refine our approach to this program. So we thank you very much for your feedback. And as it says here, this is what we call a leading edge membership program. And if you haven't become a leading edge member, go to our website, nonprofitquarterly.org, and you'll see leading edge membership right there on the homepage in the upper right-hand corner. And you can click on there to find out about all of these webinars, access to our online magazine, et cetera, that comes with being a leading edge member. It's a really great package for our active users. So thank you so much for considering that. So Maisha, welcome. Maisha Forbes is with Koya Partners, and I'll let you introduce yourself and then we'll build on that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jean. It's great to be here. I am Maisha Forbes. I have 2 titles. That's a lot of words you see on the screen. It's definitely a hybrid role. One aspect of my work is I am a managing director of executive search, placing leaders in mission-driven and nonprofit organizations across the country. And then the second piece, the other way I spend my time is working with organizations to help them work through human capital challenges, doing a lot of strategic advising and human capital consulting around many issues across the HR, talent, and DEI spectrum. And so thus the Senior Vice President of Culture, Inclusion, and Strategic Advising title, which I use both of them at different times. And I've been at Koya for 8 years now. And prior to that, I had spent some of my career in nonprofit and for-profit, but the nonprofit side was mostly in education organizations, where I grew up in the talent and HR function. So I've had the pleasure of being internally in a role, but also functioning as a consultant for many years now, and like to bring that internal and external perspective to my work with my clients. And I'm just super excited to be here to talk about something that is very important to me, but also that I see organizations struggling with, and I'm happy to, help them think through. Thank you.
That's great. And I thought we would be transparent that we've met each other before and that we're both really passionate about this approach. For those of you who don't know me, I worked for 18 years at Compass Point Nonprofit Services in the Bay Area, which was one of the original kind of homes of what came to be known as nonprofit executive transitions work. So I've really seen firsthand the growth of this discipline over 20 to 25 years and how we have continued to refine it in the sector. And I think what you and I would argue is how we need to evolve it or expand it or make it more agile to a much different operating context than when we first conceived of succession planning and transition in nonprofits, to build on that legacy, but expand it quite considerably. So that's what we're going to talk about today, right? So let's talk about how we're going to organize the conversation. I always like to share this with you so you can kind of anticipate this arc and locate your questions, et cetera. So the first thing I'm going to ask Maisha is to talk a little bit about this sort of provocative title. Why are we interrogating the language of succession planning and kind of the assumptions that go with it? Why do we think it's overdue that nonprofit leaders do that? Then the second piece of the conversation is going to be, okay, well, if pathway planning, which is language that Maisha and her colleagues have developed, is an alternative, or again, an expansion. Let me say it's an expansion. We're not throwing things away, right, Maisha? We are saying the operating
That's
context is just wildly different. And we've learned from 25 years of succession planning and executive transition. We should be in a different place. So what do we mean by pathway planning? And what do we mean by the kinds of capacities that organizations from the very small to the very large can build in to be more agile in the way they think about talent development and filling senior roles? The third thing, and this is really exciting to me, since Maisha is a vice president at one of the most important national search firms dedicated to mission-driven organizations. And I should say that, I mean, Koya has emerged, I'll say it so you don't have to, as one of the premier search firms, founded by women, founded with an equity ethos, and now expanded all across the country. So to have you talk about whether or when we should use search is really exciting. And then we'll close with some concrete steps that folks can take now. So that's our arc, okay? So let's start with this notion of why you wanted to call this succession planning as outdated. What do we really mean by challenging that assumption, Maisha?
You know, it is a little bit provocative, first of all, so it grabs people's attention, and we want your attention so you can hear us say that it's not just about succession planning. It's not just about focusing on that one role, right? Succession planning historically has been focusing on the senior most role so that if something happens to that person when they leave, you know, that there's a plan in place to replace them. But it is so singular and so focused on that one role that it's without consideration for all the vast amounts of talent and opportunity that lie within the organization that surround this person. And all of those people are what really support this person in their work, right? They really know and they do the work through this person, and, you know, through this person influencing their work, whether directly or indirectly. And so we want to get away from just saying succession planning and thinking differently about how we utilize every person in an organization to plan well for the future. And thus we came up with thinking about pathways through the organization. That's pathway planning. And we often like to add intentional pathway planning, because that shows that it's about proactivity. It's about being proactive. It's about thinking of it not just as, you know, you see in bullet number 2, not just about this event, this one thing that happens, you know, when someone steps down, whether surprisingly or not surprisingly. You know, it's not just about, you know, when if something happens. It's, you know, if anything, we've learned in this age of a pandemic that crises can happen quickly. It can happen with immediacy. It can happen with urgency, and it can be incredibly widespread. And so you need to be ready for that. But getting into a mindset that transitions are normal, they should be expected, and they should be anticipated. Thus, the activity of, you know, planning for them, and just acknowledging that it's okay. It's okay for that to happen. And you actually should be leading with an expectation mindset that it's coming. It's an inevitability. Although we love our leader is wonderful, but it's inevitable that they won't be here forever. So how do we ensure that the organization is prepared for that inevitability? Those are, you know, some of the things I like for people to keep in mind with this work. I also think that, you know, per those last bullet, traditionally succession planning is so focused on, you know, what does that person do? Like they always say, write a manual, create this, you know, create the to-do list in case you get hit by a bus. You know, that's always the thing we want people to put in place. And actually,
bus that's coming for all of us.
Bus, that inevitable bus, right? I think we've hit the bus. The bus is here. But I think it's less about the job and more about understanding the role, understanding the leadership influence, the sphere of influence, understanding the impact that this person has on decision-making, on culture, on all the pieces that make this organization run. That is critical to consider when thinking about succession planning, and now the planning for it and pathway planning. So it's much bigger. It's just being more vast and expansive in your thinking rather than hyper-focused on that one role.
Well, and then there's all this language that we all repeat. Oh, can everyone review this job description, which is 8 pages? And it always is, right?
Always.
And so, of course, if you review an 8-page job description, we're all also going to say the same thing, like, wow, this is not a doable job. Are we going to be okay with cutting this job up? I mean, it's like, and at this age, it's like, how many times are we going to say that, I guess, is my question, before we realize that this process isn't necessarily yielding the conversation we need to be having. And I love what you just said, was it's less about every single thing this person did, but more about really understanding their role, their sphere of influence, what will be missing when they step out.
Mm-hmm.
And are there other people that have that capacity or that have an analysis of some of that we don't need anymore, or both, right? So it's just so interesting to me at this stage in my career, how repetitive some of these processes are across all different types of organizations, sizes, budgets.
Completely agree. Mm-hmm.
Would you mind if I amplified point 4?
Please feel free. I love that.
Well, I think this is part of why I wanted so much for you to come and talk to our audience, which is not only do we find ourselves saying the same things over and over, wow, this is an undoable job, and blah, blah. A lot of times these processes, while they may have we're going to do 6 or 8 informational interviews or what have you, almost like kind of SWOT type thinking at the beginning, the process itself, the process of planning for someone to leave, does not morph to fit the actual operating context. It's as if we have to stop what we know and go into this mode now because we're in succession or transition mode. And that's the piece for me that feels outdated, because we're just much more agile as organizations. We're more distinct. We're more of the moment.
I think that's exactly right. It's like, to use an athletic term, you have to turn on a dime to, look to think about, oh, we got to replace this leader. And then all of a sudden, all eyes and all energies are focused on that thing, such that you're dropping critical work. You're, moving away from, project plans that were in place, that were going well, that were successful, to pivot and think about this thing, when actually, if everyone's constantly thinking about the path to, replacing this person, when the need arises in that inevitable time frame, then there's no need to feel such a stark reaction to pivot. It doesn't feel so forced. It doesn't feel harsh. That can feel difficult for an organization, where every meeting, every, communication becomes about, well, what are we going to do about this replacement? It becomes hyper focused on that, and it takes away from the work or the quality of the work.
That describes my experience on every side of this issue so well. This sort of stop and pivot, as opposed to, okay, this is happening. As you say in number 2, this is normal. It's painful or it's nerve-wracking, but this is normal. How do we fold it into where we already are and imbue it with where we already are? It's so interesting to me. Okay. So these are some of your offerings, which I clearly am resonating with, about why we need to kind of rejigger our thoughts about this. And some of them are very ongoing, like orienting to normality versus events. And some of them are even when the thing happens, when we have to start succession planning for a key role, what's our stance when we get into that space? That's what I hear. Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about this building on. I won't call it alternative. I'll call it building on, taking the good from all of this work that's been done and expanding it to fit this current understanding of organization. So what do you mean by pathway planning?
So it's just thinking about, at every place in the organization, how can I be preparing people, both, professionally in terms of the work that they're doing and with the tools to do their jobs, with regard to expertise and skills and competencies, but also culturally. How do I prepare everyone for culturally what is coming? And it's about change. So essentially, it's really about ingraining change management into your processes, and thinking about change management as something that we all can do, and not being afraid of it or ashamed of it, should I say. All too often there's negative feelings attached to the idea of change management. But when you're proactive, you can think about change management differently. You think about managing change as opposed to change managing you, right? And hopefully that's a place organizations can get to. And so it's really understanding, what is your talent landscape? What do you have out there? What is happening both on an individual level and on an organizational level? And what I like to describe is that there's a reciprocal relationship that's happening. There's reciprocity that's required on the part of the individual and the organization. There's things that I need to do in my personal journey and making sure that people know what I want to do, making sure I assess and understand my own desires, and that I communicate that, that I, express that I take advantage of opportunities internally to let others know that that's my responsibility. That onus is on me. People may compliment me, they may see me doing good work, but they can't read my mind, right? They don't know that I want to get into something a little bit different. I want to use my skills differently. I need to say those things. That's on the individual, but it's on the organization to provide the opportunities and the platforms for that, starting with the manager just saying, how are you doing? How is it going? Those periodic check-ins, like, let's talk about your role. Let's talk about your future, whether your future is a year from now or 5 years from now. Let's talk about how we can help you get there. So constantly in a building mindset of, what can we do to help you to get better as an individual? Because the organization is going to benefit from that, no matter what seat you're sitting in. And then we're working together to ensure that people are really taking advantage of and leaning into this idea of pathways and opportunities across the organization. And there's probably one last thing is the accountability factor of holding one another accountable. I, as an individual, should feel comfortable holding my manager accountable to understanding what I want to do, whether it's taking advantage of an individual development plan, whether it's, putting a little bit more time and energy into my performance management plans that, they enact with me. And as a manager, you can, hold the organization accountable for providing the tools, the space, the time to do these things and to do them well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that idea of the reciprocity of it. And yeah. You have a big HR background. I think, unfortunately, a lot of HR systems also get very codified in a way that these questions that you've posed here or these stances aren't always what's led with.
Yeah.
Right. We're often looking at past performance or, meeting objectives set a year ago or, some of those traditional frames of HR. And again, we're not throwing those away, but we are saying, if we connect it to an organization being ready for transition on an ongoing basis, that means that there's some portion of the people, I think, that are really in a growth mode, and that we know, to your point here, we know who they are. And to this last point, how their growth mode is both contributing to and being influenced by how the organization is changing.
That's exactly right.
That's what I think I'm hearing you talk about, that sense making that leaders need to be able to do, to see how people are rising and shaping the organization and how the organization can be shaped by them, that sort of reciprocity.
And that's exactly right. And it's all happening simultaneously. This is all going on. And so you're putting systems and mechanisms in place for good communication around these things, but also good feedback to be given. Everyone knows when they're doing something really well. People are very apt to give that feedback and to give it often and to say it loudly. But how do they know when they can do better? And also, do they have an opportunity to express when they want to learn something? An organization should always be functioning with the assumption that everyone wants to learn, but it doesn't always have to be they have to learn in the same way, or they have to learn in a very linear fashion, which is more for a traditional, view of these things. As an org chart, you go up and down, and people move through the organization in a very linear way. That's more traditional, as opposed to so many organizations are not anymore. Not the way they operate, the way we're taking a team's approach to doing work, to doing big projects, to, managing, even roles in a very team-oriented way. It needs to be met with that same level of creativity and entrepreneurial spirit.
Great. Let's talk a little bit about one of the fears that people have about this approach, is that everybody will want to be the leader.
Yes. Yes, I would say, and I've heard that. I've heard leaders say, well, what if there's a role we need to, there's a transition in place, and we ask everyone what they want to do, and we've kind of opened the floodgates to get feedback, and everybody wants to be that person at the top. I can pretty much guarantee not everyone wants that role. First of all, not everyone is built that way. Not everyone wants that level of decision making, wants that level of kind of eyes on them. If you do some level of assessments and getting to know people, you can see what personality styles and what kind of tendencies actually would be best in that leadership role. If people know themselves, I always say, know thyself first, right? If you know what you're good at and what you're inclined to do well, and how you're inclined to make decisions, many people would say, that role isn't for me, but here's where I play best. There may be more than one person who is interested, but it's very seldom the case that everybody wants that senior role. And so don't let that prevent you from thinking broadly about looking internally at your talent pool and really nurturing that talent pool to move upwards to the organization.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I have experienced people being afraid that somebody's going to get the wrong message. If we let everybody explore their pathways, what if somebody picks a pathway we don't want them to pick, right? So I think there's some of that honest dialogue and communication that you talked about that's required. Can you talk a little bit about the third bullet?
Oh, yeah. So this one comes from the idea that people, when you're in a role and you're thinking about growth, it doesn't have to be that, a little bit like I was demonstrating. People think growing linearly in a linear fashion is the only way to do things. That's not it at all. It is, so sorry. It's about actually growing in the space that you're in, growing where you are, as we said in a previous slide. And that means that getting deeper in what you're doing, understanding, how to get confident, improve competencies next to you, understand how to learn from the person who's in a function that's kind of adjacent to you, where you're doing a lot of cross-functional work. How do you really benefit from those people? How do you benefit from those ways of growing? That's growth, right? It doesn't always have to be moving up. That we need to get away from that for people to understand that learning happens, first of all, every day, and it doesn't have to happen just when you're getting a promotion. That's not you showing growth or demonstrating growth. That's actually you, leaning into the opportunity for this to happen in a very everyday fashion, an everyday way.
Yeah, it seems like one of the complicating things is compensation. And I know you're not going to address that directly here on the slide, but I observe that it gets complicated when people are doing a good job of expanding their job. Maybe that job is getting more important in the organization as they learn more, right? So we can keep changing the job to fit its greater importance and the greater skill. Of course, there's often also a compensation issue there too, right? And is that sometimes where we get tripped up on these moving up, right?
Yeah, right. So we think that. Yeah, that's a great point, Dean, and you're right. We don't have to talk about numbers in order to acknowledge that sometimes the assumption is, I need to move up, and growth is getting a bigger salary, and bigger title denotes that I'm moving up and doing more. And actually, growing over time and getting more compensation isn't just about the bigger title or the promotion. Organizations have to be willing to think about, is this person actually contributing in a different way such that we need to honor that and offer them more compensation, or rethink their compensation, rethink where they are in the salary band a bit differently, right? As opposed to just thinking, oh, we give people these big jumps when they get promoted to the next role or to the bigger title. How do you make sure you're constantly assessing how big is your role? How full is your plate, and honoring that from a compensation perspective, and finding the ways to naturally understand what's happening on that side. But it does not have to just be about, I have to grow linearly because I need to get more money. And a lot of people may be thinking that, and I understand that. But if an organization leads with the value of, we understand that your growth may not be, moving from title to title, but we're going to honor you taking on extra work, more work, and things that are very concretely adding to the professional that you are. We want to find a way to honor that. I think that's values-driven evidence that organizations can show in how they're looking and thinking about their employees' growth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's something that needs to be kind of unpacked, isn't it? That how we deal with performance, how we deal with promotion, how we deal with compensation, because so often they aren't dealt with in a holistic way. And that, it seems to me, would trip up some of this good thinking, right? Or prevent people from leaning all the way into this approach.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So let's talk a little bit about what you see as some of the challenges and the opportunities of building this kind of capacity.
Yeah. The first bullet I have to say, we get this a lot, and Gene, I know you've heard this or you've seen this in your work, the first thing organizations will say is, I can't do this. I don't know where to start. I don't have the capacity to do this. I don't have a person who owns this. I'm too small and we don't have the resources. We're just getting by. We're just getting by. We don't have the capacity to do this or to do it well. And I think we've got to stop saying that. Every organization has some level of communication plans. So every organization has some level of performance management. Whether or not you like it or it's good or it's valuable, that can be questioned, but it's there. And so how do you make sure you're taking advantage of opportunities to build on what you have or to improve what you have? And it can be in a very low cost way. It doesn't cost anything for managers to constantly be asking their team, what's working for you? What do you want to do? Where do you see yourself? How are things going? What are you learning from that project you just did? Let me give you some feedback on how I saw you really navigating some new territory and how I think what I think that could translate into with regard to your learning. That is all free. And so not being constrained by budget, because right now I think everybody is in a budget constrained environment, but I'm hopeful that the learning and the growing isn't going to stop, because everyone is figuring out what what in a COVID, in the times of a pandemic or the implications of COVID are, what that's doing to our ability to offer professional development and performance management. Everyone's going to be reeling from that. So we all have to step back a little bit and think, what are the low cost or no cost ways we can continue this work and continue growth and development in a very values oriented way that aligns with our values, but also that shows we are actually intentionally doing something. That's the intentionality behind the pathway planning, and it's everybody's responsibility, really. Everybody plays a part on doing this work, and you don't need to have a senior director or a VP of learning and development. You can really start with, like I said, embedding the good practices amongst managers, amongst teams, listening to your people, seeing what they're saying, what they need. Things like a lunch and learn are free to put on for someone who's just doing this really well and who has some good best practices to share. Those things are really easy. There's ways to do this so you're not always looking outside to external help or consulting help or contractors to come in and do this work to help your staff to get better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, to me, it goes back to your point about the connection to organizational development. So we have a number of questions about what about flat organizations, what about small organizations? And if I'm hearing you right, we're talking about all boats rising. So, these are adult learning is people can get better and better and better at what they do. Yes. And in so doing, become more and more and more valuable, more and more strategic, more and more innovative, without necessarily creating new positions.
Exactly.
So like you said, sometimes you might reward that with compensation. Sometimes you might acknowledge that with a title change. But yes. And the process of, even a small flat group of people intentionally getting better and better at what they do, that's what we're trying to facilitate, right?
Exactly. And I think the advantage that small and to medium sized organizations have is that numbers. There's a smaller amount of people that you have to keep track of. And so when you think about it, putting in place some communication mechanisms, that's less places for the communication to have to go, right? When you're in a large matrix organization, we all know how communication gets broken by virtue of the number of stops it has to make. When you have a relatively flat or relatively small organizations with regard to numbers, you can ask people what they want or you can do assessments and understand their talent and skills and actually be able to act on it a little bit faster. Because the smaller numbers, but how do you make sure you're doing that and capitalizing on that to get work done instead of always assuming, let me go find new help, new perspectives, new voices? Not to say those aren't valuable, but start internally first, because that is faster, more cost effective. And at the end of the day, it actually helps people to feel more engaged in their work when they know that's happening regularly, right? That's the cultural implication. Better retention, better engagement for people to know that they care it doesn't have to be a software that you purchase that helps me to understand my professional development. But if you're constantly asking me, I can't deny that it's important to you and to the organization.
Mhm. You talk a lot about in your work about needs and gaps,
Hmm.
and that if we're
Yeah.
doing this kind of ongoing assessment, not just annual performance reviews or waiting for someone to resign, but this ongoing connection between our talent development and our organizational evolution, it both necessitates and allows for us to do this, right? So tell us what
Hmm.
you mean here.
Yeah. So, the underlying assumption in this particular slide is that it is a way of being. I think you mentioned that it's kind of an operating norm, and it's normalizing these behaviors, as I've been mentioning, is consistently doing these things, so that you're normalizing it. It becomes a part of who you are, and just utilizing the various tools you have. What do you have, at your fingertips that you can use or use a little differently? Do you have working groups? Do you have, I would say organizations that have gone to using an internal communication mechanism like Slack, there is so much opportunity to utilize that for development purposes or sharing. And sharing can facilitate development because you're sharing lessons, you're sharing learning, you're sharing feedback. And so really
Interesting.
taking advantage of something like a Slack or a GChat or whatever you're using internally is a very, again, low cost, but can be very effective when you put some norms around it, right? And I mentioned before, the more you engage people in this way, that is a powerful retention strategy. That is your retention tactic. I imagine that many times we've reading exit interviews and people are saying, no one ever asked me how I felt. No one cared what I wanted. The Gallup 12, one of those questions is, I'm paraphrasing, but it's like basically, do you feel like, your voice is valued, or do you feel like people value your opinion? And oftentimes if they say no, that is a huge dip in engagement, but you can change that again by meeting people where they are and finding ways to utilize the tools that you already have. I mentioned individual development plans earlier. I've seen
How do you define
organizations.
that? Sorry, when
Yeah.
you, I know I've heard that term
Oh,
IDP,
yeah.
but roughly what does that
Yeah.
entail?
So an IDP meeting, it can be anything from a one pager to a sophisticated kind of manual that you use to document what is, how you want to develop. I've created them in the past where it's been everything from, a person actually gathering information about themselves. I remember creating one because one organization was really big on assessments. And so in one box, you'd have what their MBTI was, what their strengths finders were, and then also, what do you want to do? What do you like about your current job? Where do you see your greatest skills? Where do you see your biggest opportunities or areas to improve? When you're able to capture all that
Mm,
and actually look at that with someone over time, time over time, every 6 months, every quarterly, but definitely once a year feels too long. But every 6 months, given how fast we operate in this space, you are finding ways to learn more about them constantly. And when you're going back to that plan, that whether it's again one page or if it's an entire manual that spells out what you can do in the organization. If you have a competency model within the organization, it should be a part of that individual development plan, meaning here are the competencies I want to grow in, here's what I do well, here's where I want to spend some more time, but how do you do that? And the
mhm.
development plan will say, I'm going to do that by volunteering for this project. I'm going to do that by exposing myself to more of this function or this person who actually does this really well. It's a way to actually document everything we're saying and capture it, so that there's just a kind of a way to house it. And
Mhm.
also as an accountability measure. Hopefully it's not getting put in a drawer somewhere, but you're constantly pulling it out with your manager and saying, let's revisit this. Let's look at where we are. And that leads to that last bullet is, it's not a one size fits all plan that you should put in place in terms of developing people. The pathways are not one size fits all. Like, oh, you are an associate, you do this, or you're a coordinator, you do this. You have to think again more expansively. Think about, how do you create, the idea of job families, how competencies trickle down into job families, like, the underlying skill of recruiting and fundraising is essentially the same thing. It's sales, right? And so how do you make sure someone feels good about their ability to hop from a recruiting job to a development role if they want to they want to be closer to funders, they want to be closer to the external work. But you can learn that when they say in their development plan, I'd love to learn more about how we're funded. And I'd love to be exposed more to when we're making those big asks. Maybe this is someone in another shop, but they can move easily to that
Yep.
if you're thinking about it from a competency perspective.
So many great bosses I've had never went to meetings alone, right? I mean, it's that learning on the job, right?
Yes,
There's a
exactly.
couple questions here about one risk that I know you encounter a lot, which is if we really do this, won't we lose people? You know, that they'll get so good that they'll
Yeah.
be ready to step into a senior leadership position that we don't have somewhere else. How do we
Yeah.
recognize that as part of this investment?
I would say this is the part that a lot of people may not want to hear from me, so I apologize in advance. I'm going to say I think we have to accept to some degree that that's an inevitability as well. But we're hoping that if you're doing this, first of all, you're going to get more time out of people the more you keep them engaged, right? So you're buying more time by increasing your engagement through these active retention strategies. So you're getting some more time than you normally would. But if they get to a place where they're being handpicked to do something else, the hope is that maybe they're staying in the sector. And so you just did your part to help drive forward the entire sector. I know that feels probably a little too broad sweeping for some people who really are thinking, I don't want to hemorrhage talent from my organization. And we don't want that. But if you don't do this internally, the risk that you're going to run is that you're going to be stagnant and you're going to lose people anyway because they're going to see it being done elsewhere. They're going to see their ability to grow and learn and develop, whether in one seat or moving up and out in another place, and they're going to leave anyway. And so you have to come to terms with that a little bit, and
Mhm.
then try to think about how do we, in the meantime, keep them as long as possible, but eventually you may have to let them go.
So in doing this, just to also underscore, you will potentially, especially in small and mid-sized organizations, but maybe in large ones too, you will identify some gaps. You may identify skills gaps that the overall organization needs, or that a department needs, or that future role is going to require, right? So it's being
That's
honest about
exactly
that
right.
too.
Yes.
Mhm.
It is, and we've seen that in working with organizations. You're going to identify those skills. You have to be honest about where you can actually meet that need, and where sometimes they need to go elsewhere. Whether they need to go elsewhere to find that development, whether it's a free class or a training elsewhere. But sometimes you have to own that. Maybe this is eventually you have to be willing to say, you know what, we've done everything we can for you in this role. And I would say oftentimes people boomerang back to an organization
Mhm.
if they are attached to the mission, attached to the culture, and feel good enough about the culture that they go out and get some opportunity or some learning or some title that they couldn't get. And then they come back. Maybe the organization has grown or something in the meantime.
The other thing that people are raising, I think, is very appropriate, is that there is some conflict, both sort of uh, culturally and process-wise, with traditional HR. This
Hmm.
is a more individualized approach.
Yeah.
It's not a one-size-fits-all.
Yeah.
It's not a risk management dominant approach. You know,
Hmm.
some of those things, right?
Agree.
So how do
Hmm.
you, if you have a more traditional HR function, there's some question about how do I advocate, how do managers operate in this way with their team, but also have to comply with these more traditional boxes and scores and ratings and, you know, all that
Yeah.
stuff.
Hopefully we'll get to a point where there's, this open, there's openness between, the traditional, HR, the processes that need to be done, the things that need to happen, and the fact that managers are leading with more inquisition, with more assessment on the ground, right? And so it doesn't have to be completely separate. They could be working together and overlaid on top of one another. So
Mhm.
maybe your HR function, you do a twice yearly evaluation, a mid-year and a once a year full performance review. And that's fine. But in the meantime, what are you doing to build towards that? You use those as your markers, if you will, and then
Mhm.
say, well, between now and the 6 month mark, this is what I want to see in terms of improvement. Then you come out of that 6 month and say, here's what you did well. But in order for you to get promoted or to, get this thing in this next 6 months, here's what we need to work on. Using those as kind of your milestones on the way and that development plan, but you can still plant some additional ones, right? You can hopefully you're having one-on-one check-ins, but we know how that goes. But if not, if you're not having regular one-on-ones, hopefully you're pulling up at least once a month to ask these questions. And when you're embedding these questions, they can wrap up into those more traditional milestones that we see on the calendar. So it doesn't mean kind of avoiding them, scrapping them, or not adhering to them. It just means utilize them as a part of your process, but you can also kind of bolster your process in many respects without needing an additional HR person to do that. A lot of it is on managers to know and understand the value that this would bring.
Yeah. And as one of our participants said, good HR is in line with this now, right?
Yes,
I mean, this
exactly.
is very much a talent development mindset.
Yes.
As opposed to a risk management mindset as dominant.
Yes.
They're both important, but
that is the hope.
That's the hope, and that's the work that we're doing. And I think there are still real pressures, that organizations face, again, around compensation, around decision making, a whole set of things that hiring and promotion that are tensions that even the best and most progressive HR functions have to deal with, right? That's part of the work. Yes. Can we talk a little bit about equity? Part of what we have been saying for so long in the sector, and certainly is being screamed right now, is we've got to get more pathways for leaders of color into senior positions and into executive roles. How does a pathways approach align with that?
Yeah. I think, Jean, this is something I am personally very passionate about. And I think the pathway planning concept actually was born out of how do we ensure more diversity at different levels? And how do we help organizations who are veritably, quote unquote, upside down? Those organizations who they want to mirror the demographic of the clients that they serve, the people they serve, and they may consider themselves very diverse. But when you look more closely, the diversity is at a certain level. And so you have, most of the people of color or the Black and brown people at the associate coordinator manager level, but then at the senior level, you have very few. And so how do you kind of help to even that out, balance that out? How do you help to open up access for more voices to reach the senior levels and the executive levels of the organization? That's really where a lot of this was born out of. And some of it came out of thinking creatively about, development programs, professional development programs, or, even internally kind of cohorts. How do you have a cohort approach to helping leaders, like leaders of color, for example, or maybe it's women, maybe it's, whatever community is, needs to be more represented within the organization. How do you create a plan for those people to get more, opportunities, to get more access, to learn more? And so that's one way to actually enact these pathways, is creating those, those programs internally. But then another way is, again, understanding what talent you have. And so when you're opening up the ranks and saying, let's assess across the board, and you're really understanding, oh, wow, I didn't know that my finance coordinator actually used to be an HR associate, and I'm hiring for an HR manager now who's going to do payroll. So they need some of that finance background. Like, wow, that would work nicely, but here's what I need to do to get them there, right? It really started with how you really think about diversity and inclusion at all levels, in a way that really takes advantage of the idea of acquisition, assessment, and understanding where your talent lies. There has to be an eye on this. So often we will step back and look at organizations and they'll say, well, what are your pain points? And they'll say, well, internally people think we don't promote, our staff of color. Well, actually, what are your numbers saying? What does the data say? And if the data says you're not, then let's think about why that is. Maybe sometimes you just don't know what's going well, or, and, speaking the language of bias, there's a halo and horns effect sometimes. When someone doesn't do well on one project, it follows them forever. Or someone who may do well on a project, it follows them, but that's the one thing they've done well. And it's difficult to get away from that when you're meeting people where they are, and managers are asking more questions and allowing them to take more accountability for their development in a IDP or what have you. This opens up this opens up pathways for inclusion and equity at all levels. And that's really the essence of what we all want, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's so much to say there. If people are thinking about this at the senior executive or executive role, we just published a great piece the other day called Failure is Not an Option, how organizations can support leaders of
Oh,
color.
yeah.
And part of that is understanding and visibilizing the pathways to leadership and the kinds of skills and talents that are already being manifest, but maybe not recognized
Agree.
in a traditional frame.
Completely agree.
So let's talk a little bit about search. Let's assume for the moment that we are leaning into this, and maybe some folks are already doing it who are participating, and some are moving in that direction for all the good reasons you've laid out. So what is the role of search? How should we think of that in our toolbox?
Yeah. So, again, I live in executive search. It is a part of my role. I breathe it daily. And so I see the value of it. I see the value of getting help when you need it. But on the other hand, I also think that some of the most productive searches I've ever done have been when an organization has said, we've done the work internally and we actually recognize that where the need we have is not present internally, although we've done everything we could, and here's why, here's exactly what you need to go look for, and then we go find that person. That is much more productive for a search partner than when we're looking for that thing that's like the elusive, not really sure what exactly the skill is, or the leadership competency, or the quality, and then you have those internal candidates who kind of being dragged along in the process, but not really truly being evaluated. And that can just really be disruptive to culture again, and disruptive to engagement. And so, as the slide says, it's a huge risk of hiring, someone, externally who doesn't know who doesn't really understand. You can understand how the organization, like what the organization is about and the mission, but that's that inner working, how it works and what your belief system truly is. That when you have that internally and you're able to take that institutional knowledge and promote someone into this leadership position, you're going to get so much more value, and the organization is going to be able to get more done faster instead of waiting for this new person to acclimate and to really understand those cultural nuances, which takes a while. So there's a calculated risk on both sides, but I advise people, and I know I'm talking myself out of work here, but I'd be remiss if I didn't say we want you to do the work internally, because then it feels even better when you decide that search is the way to go. It feels like, it's the right thing, and that leader who comes in actually is empowered and understands more about the landscape because you've actually assessed it, you've figured it out.
I just think that's such a powerful idea. So even if you decide, or especially if you decide to go outside, I really want to underscore what you're saying. If you decide to go outside, it's because you have explicitly done the work of assessing what's needed and together identified that it's not here.
Exactly.
And that we would benefit, not because there aren't great people here, but there's this skills gap, this diversity gap, this perspective or experience gap. And we just really do think that by adding this new set of skills or perspective, we're going to get stronger. But we don't just pretend that the people aren't here, or that they might not have thought they were ready, or, we actually look at what we have and say, okay, and we have done that, and we're going out to get somebody on purpose. We agree we need something. Yeah?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the example I use, Jean, is imagine, for anyone listening, I feel like imagine or remember if you've ever seen a search happen, and it always feels like it's kind of off on the side. It's kind of this thing that's happening. You're getting updates about it. If the search firm is good, and they're giving you good communication, you kind of understand what they're doing, what they're looking for. You might see the job description posted on your website, maybe you see it external, but you always feel like it's, a little bit off in the distance, right? And you don't necessarily feel included in that process, or you don't have a voice in that process, even though, let's say you've been at the organization for 10 to 15 years. Maybe you've decided that you only want to be a senior manager or a director level, so you've been in that seat for that long. And that's okay, but you do good work. Someone may not come to you immediately and say, I need you to be one of the stakeholders that give feedback on this search, but you probably have a perspective that is so rich and so important, but you feel like your voice was not utilized or it was undervalued. And we see that happen all the time. Imagine, however, on the flip side, if you internally, everyone knows that the work is being done to really, truly understand where the talent lies and who does what really well, who is, where people's skills are, growing, where they're deepening. People will have no problem with a search firm coming in because they feel like the baseline that they're starting from is much more inclusive and it's much more well known. It's actually a rich baseline to start from.
Thank
That
you for that.
feels
That's a
much better.
really, really powerful practice shift. Thank you.
Hmm.
Um, Now, nonetheless, search is a very useful tool. And there are times
It
when you do
is.
that great work and it's really
Yes.
clear and we're excited to go out and add
Yes.
someone to our team.
Yes.
So that's what you have here are some, yes, use search in this situation, not so much in this. Can you quickly
Yeah.
walk us through these?
Yeah. So yes, use it when you address the critical skills gap, and you realize that you know what that you don't have it, you need it. There is something new, something that it's not represented, and or you're at a critical point in the organization where the strategic evolution of the organization is such that you need a new leader or you need an infusion of new thought. That is definitely a reason to use search. You want to increase diversity when you recognize that, yeah, you don't have anyone internally, a person of color that you could promote, or a person of, this particular background, this particular, identity that you need to have represented on an executive team. Go find that. And also when you want to add new types of positions, that just maybe it's a functionally specific thing that you just don't have because it's new, you're growing, you're changing the landscape of who you're serving. That is a reason to go to search because they can find that person in a much easier way, much more targeted way. But don't do it if it honestly, if so for lack of a better way to describe it, if it's all for show, if it's just to show that, you went and did a national search for this person and you found this person. Don't do it if it's just to be able to say that. Don't do it if your board is if your board, and I don't say this callously because I understand the value and the power and the relationships of board members, but don't do it if it's just to appease them, particularly if they're a little bit further removed from the day-to-day work. Don't do it for those reasons. And then lastly, don't do it if you're avoiding dealing with the things internally that you need to deal with in order to understand, exactly what you want. So if you haven't done the work to figure out exactly what this person should be working on, what some of the challenges are going to be, figure that out first, and don't do it just to cover those up because they're always going to come to the surface.
Mm-hmm. That's super helpful. I think there's still, I know because I'm on boards and I consult organizations, there are just still a lot of folks that think if you can afford it, search is the optimum. Search is the Cadillac or the Lexus or whatever, wherever we are now.
Exactly.
And we can't afford it, unfortunately, as opposed to does our situation call for it? And
Exactly.
So what you're saying is, again, that work, that assessment work is what helps you decide
Yes.
if search is absolutely the way to go, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. It's a critical piece missing. Let's go and find that, and it makes the search so much smoother.
Yeah.
It does.
We've got somebody advocating for the use of interims. Absolutely. I would think that,
Yes.
We,
Easy. Yes.
yeah, absolutely. None of this is in contradiction to that.
No.
Sometimes interims are internal, sometimes they're external.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great strategy, and there's lots of literature on how effective that can be. So thank you for raising that.
That's right.
So let's talk a little bit about steps that are very concrete, free or nearly free, that you would suggest organizational leaders might try if they're maybe have a toe in this water, but need to make a further shift or want to make a further shift, I should say.
Yeah. I think the first thing is to take stock of, what is your track record with developing staff and hiring from within. If you have no track record, then obviously you have a lot of work to do. But if you have a track record, but it's been all the same kind of people or the same people from the same background, then you need to think about, okay, how do you approach this pathway planning with more of an equity lens, with more diversity, equity, inclusion lens? That is, that goes without being said, you have to do that. But you have to start there and just kind of take stock. And then you want to involve your staff. You have to meet them where they are, and you have to ask or survey them about their developmental priorities, their needs, their desires. All those are wrapped into that. You have to, kind of think about the role that accountability is going to play in this work. If it can be a person, that's great, and that person can be responsible for how they work with managers, how they make sure this is, throughout the organization embedded. But if it's not a person, what are the other mechanisms, and then how How do you ensure communication about those mechanisms? And then maybe it's a task force. Oftentimes, if you don't have a person that you can assign, you do things in a task force way. I like task force because task forces because it's a distributed authority, or a distributed distribution of power is different in a task force than it may be naturally within the organization, which says something about culture and voice. So do that to help think about, the skill gaps and the needs that you have across the organization. And then, dedicate time to this, dedicating staff retreats, whether it's a team retreat or a team, whether that retreat is a half a day or a day long, to an all staff retreat that could be a few days. A lot of us are doing things virtually. So virtually now, retreats are much more cost effective than bringing everyone to a city or a different state. And so thinking about how do you gather in groups in order to do some of this work and move it forward for the better of the organization.
I love these ideas, and partly I recognize in them that there's the higher you up are in an organization, even in an organization of 8 or 10 or 20 or 30 people, the further you get from people's daily experience of trying to find their pathway. Mm-hmm. And so having some space for people to articulate what path they think they're on, where they feel a roadblock, what paths they've seen others take. Often staff have narratives about, as you said, you called it halo and horns. I thank you for that. Like, people have narratives like, oh, she did that and got promoted. So is that how you get promoted? You do public speaking, or you get a grant, or these things get celebrated and
perception
as that's how you get it, right? So having this space, it sounds like, to listen, to gather data, to find out what those narratives are.
Yes.
And then figure out if they're even the ones you want, or if you meant them.
Right.
And start to say, well, what do we want? That's really powerful.
Or how to counter those narratives. That's right.
4 minutes here. So I want to pose 2 of these questions. One question, and this in your search work, is when boards kind of put pressure on themselves to use search. I'm going to go back a slide because it was the point you made here, this sort of 1 and 2 here, that boards feel they need to use external search so that people on the outside will think that the person who got it earned it.
Right.
Have you seen this, where even they use search and an internal candidate is selected, but they feel good that they proved themselves in the process?
Right. They call it due diligence. Yes. Okay. We see that a lot. The board will say we need to do our due diligence and go external. But why can't due diligence be really actually helping the board see all you're doing internally and highlighting all the assessment you've done and being able to show that you think this leader is right, this internal promotion is the right way to go, and you have all the data to back it up because you've done the work internally, being able to demonstrate that. But all too often, yes, it will be to show due diligence. But in this day and age, I think an argument is that, first, it's very cost effective if you try everything internally. You've done everything possible internally. Again, in the pandemic age, everybody is thinking differently about the way they use their budgets and their funding. And so you want to try everything internally first, and before automatically thinking that search gives you that layer of validity that you don't necessarily have. Sometimes it will, don't get me wrong, but if you've done the work internally, it makes you feel all the better about going to search in the end if you have to.
Well, I like your point. Sometimes it will. Maybe there's been a history of poor selections, or there were internal selections that the community looked, askance at, and you do feel you have something to prove. Well, that's different.
That's different.
Then prove it.
That's different. Yeah, you've been making some bad cultural assessments. Yes, sure, that is different.
Right. But if that's a very specific reason. Okay, we did our work and we realized the community doesn't trust us to make a good hire, or we don't have good networks. Oh, okay, that's why we're using search. Great. I mean, to your point, then maybe there is something to prove.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Another question, another person asked if you could expand on this 3rd bullet, and this sort of, well, let's just go to search, even though we know it's a little complicated in this department or this role.
Yeah, that's probably more of a timing. It's you may go to search anyway, and it may be the right thing to do, but don't do it if you haven't done the work of unpacking what the problem is or what the problem person may be. Let's be honest, that happens. Identify what some of the challenges are. And understand what needs to shift. If this one manager is kind of creating a toxic culture internally within this executive team or this executive or in the a certain department, how do you deal with that before you assume I'm just going to go to search, bring in somebody it's going to be their problem now. That's probably the part we don't say out loud. I'm going to bring in search, I'm going to find somebody great, and I'm going to hand over all my problem children to them. Actually, let's figure out what to do about it before we automatically go to do a search and bring somebody in to what is kind of our mess beforehand.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's great. I mean, thank you for that. Thank you for saying that out loud. Let's end on this question of equity and hiring. This participant says organizations should start by having open, courageous conversations about their culture and how race factors in. So maybe this is part of the work you're talking about too, before we go out or promote from within or go out, especially to elevate leaders of color.
I think that's the kind of the more advanced work that people need to do around diversity, equity, inclusion, is admitting and understanding that the pathways in general, career pathways, career trajectories are different for people of color, depending on where they came from, what their circumstances are. It's different. You got to break down some of the systemic historical issues that are at play, that have always been at play. And when you have those conversations and when you lead with that, you can then be able to say, well, you know what, this person doesn't have fundraising experience, but you know what, they do really well. Here's what they do really well. And let's figure out how to supplement that fundraising piece, because they never had a chance to do fundraising. How do you get to the heart of some of those questions? And I think that's where the analysis of systemic issues, whether organizationally or societally, really come in, and that's the equity conversation. But that's the advanced work, but I think everyone is being prompted to do it now more so than ever before.
But you left us with that great, I think, really understandable nugget there, which is connect your own systemic issues, number one here, your own data, your own history, your own track record, with our deepening analysis of what's happening systemically outside, right? So how do we take this urgency of the moment and look at our own data and track record with unvarnished glasses and start to make some shifts?
Exactly. Start with get our own house in order, but also understanding that there are societal things at play and being honest about that, and not making excuses for that, and having, like the person said, the courageous conversation to unpack it, even if it's uncomfortable, even if this work leaves you feeling at a place where it's no closure. That's the work.
No closure, but we have to close.
Right.
The arbitrary nature of closing this conversation, but I love ending with no closure. This is the Pathways approach is very open-ended. It's very organic. It's very individualized, but it's also connected, as I hear you talk about it, to a systemic analysis and ethos about developing everybody. So thank you for sharing all of this wisdom with us today. Again, you will get this recording and the slides within a few days, and an evaluation survey is about to pop up. Thank you again, Maisha.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.